Hello, everyone. We'll just give it another moment to let folks join before we officially kick it off. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. This is our latest iteration of the On the Edge with LF Edge webinar series, where we discuss all things across the open edge ecosystem. My name is Jill. I'm going to be your host for today. Today's topic is we're going to be discussing how LF Edge projects Alvarium and EVE securely and accurately monitor the carbon footprint in the world's first biogas plant that uses only harvest waste from local agriculture as its fuel. Now, before we get into introductions for our speakers, just a couple of housekeeping items. Just a reminder that this is a live webinar. If you're watching on LinkedIn, feel free to drop your questions into the comments section. If you're watching on Zoom, please send your questions in the chat. We will answer as many questions as we can following the main presentation at the end of the webinar. So our speakers today are Matt Yeager. He's an advisor at IOTA and co-founder of DigitalMRV. Steve Todd, VP of Data Innovation and Strategy at Dell Technologies, and Kathy Jory, Global Partnerships and Outreach at Microbooks. All of these folks were involved in developing this case study and will have some great insight to share. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Matt to get us started.
Thanks, Jill. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Intro, we're going to start talking about DigitalMRV a little bit and what it is and how it tracks the carbon. DigitalMRV is the product suite that we've started to build out from the IOTA Foundation in partnership with Dell, Zedata, and a number of others, ClimateCHECK specifically as well, to start to track and provide transparency and confidence in the data around emissions and emissions monitoring. We'll go over why we need DigitalMRV a little bit, what it is, our use for distributed ledgers, and then we'll go into the case study as well. Next slide. So first, why we need DigitalMRV. There's a number of challenges with sustainability, especially sustainability accounting and reporting. Traditionally, it's been a very heavily analog industry. About 90% of the work that happens is done by hand. Auditors going to facilities, looking at data points and gathering them with a clipboard and spreadsheets, coming back and spending a lot of time going over the data that they collect while they're at these facilities to figure out what the emissions and the baselines and everything are, so that they can then submit PDFs and reports to the necessary organizations for various incentives to help make these facilities financially feasible. Next slide. So over the past 15 to 20 years, there's been a number of advancements in environmental and sustainability spaces that you can see here, but the number of MRV professionals or auditors, if you will, in the environmental space has not really increased to keep par with the demand and the changes that are happening in the industry. Next slide. Along with those changes in the growth that we're seeing in the industry, there's a huge number of errors that come from the auditing practices, the methodologies that are used to quantify the emissions and what's happening. Because they're heavily analog and it's not taking data in near real time, there's always that room for human error, and that room for human error can be pretty significant at times. Next slide. Sometimes these errors can be really dramatic as well. So you can see right here, the fertilizer industry was self-reporting an estimate of 200 metric tons of emissions, but it actually came out that it was closer to 29,000 metric tons, which is over 100x error in the reporting. So because of that, that stems back to the original problem of like, how are we auditing these emissions? What kind of data points are we gathering? How are we gathering them? All these different points of inadequacy in the industry create room for error, and that error becomes exponential in situations like this. Next slide. All of these issues we see as the underlying foundation of what's known as greenwashing, where organizations are reporting the emissions that they think they're contributing into the atmosphere or the environment, and they're trying to account for those appropriately. But then it comes out that it's a drastically different number, like we saw on the last slide. So a few things around digital MRV. One, the standards aren't keeping par with the pace of innovation and the pace of growth in the sector. And the practices aren't keeping par with the technologies that are growing that could enable them. Next slide. This comes down to misrepresenting the data and causing a lot of errors for trust along with the practice and the industries that are trying to do good. We see the issues coming from that manual process because it can take very long, sometimes 3 to 5 years for those audits to really go full circle. There's a lot of subjectivity and costliness because it's such a manually intensive process and it's really not transparent. You have all these different data points that the auditors look at, and in the end, you have a report that's summarized based on human review. And it's still a very manual process, as you can see here. So you've got the businesses, those businesses have emissions from the different things that they're doing. Auditors try to scope what those emissions are and figure out where they're coming from and create accountability to them. And then those reports are very manual. Next slide. That comes into what digital MRV is. So digital MRV is trying to digitize this monitoring or measurement, reporting, and verification process. It's taking new tools with partners that we have at Dell and Data and ClimateCHECK and others, and it's trying to say this is what digital transparency looks like for reporting these emissions, and it's trying to create new standards to accelerate innovation and also accelerate finance organizations that are trying to create good. Next slide. So you still have the businesses and the landowners, and you still have the emissions, but digitizing the path of that data stops us from having to send auditors to these facilities on annual basis or sometimes more frequently. It allows that data to be done remotely or to be audited remotely, but then you still have the problem of trust and transparency. So adding data to an immutable ledger is one aspect that can increase the confidence in the data because it brings tamper resistance, but it doesn't quantify how the data is being managed along the way. If you're taking bad data and you're putting it into a ledger, it's a little more secure, but it's still bad data. So how do we verify that data is good and that it hasn't been manipulated and that it's been managed appropriately? Next slide. So on the DLT or the blockchain side of things, there's a few aspects that we implemented. One is first-person oracles, taking data directly from facilities. We worked with what we see as the most sustainable blockchain solution or distributed ledger technology. And then in the end, it can lead into tokenization with carbon credits and things of that nature, but that's still something that we're working on standardizing with organizations like Gold Standard and support from Google as well. Next slide. We did a breakdown of the energy use of various distributed ledger technologies. There has been a significant increase in sustainability of Ethereum as one point. It used to be number 2 with like 78 kilowatt hours per transaction. Now it's less than 1 kilowatt hour per transaction, far less. So it's been a huge increase in their sustainability as they transition to Ethereum 2.0. But there are a number of other proof of stake and graph focused ledgers that are even more efficient than that. Next slide, please. So going into the pilot, we're going to talk about the project, the underlying technology, what data confidence looks like in the platform a little bit. Next slide. So the project started out with 2 pilots. It was funded through Environment and Climate Change Canada, and there were specific requirements that were identified. We needed a foundation of proven mature technologies, so things that have been established that energy or landfill or biodigester facilities have been integrating over the last decade that are proven at this point. We needed a new build site to make sure that the equipment that was integrated was highly digital or there was a digital base to go off of. This could be sensors or data management systems existing, preferably both. And then we identified 2 pilots to implement with. And then the outputs of those pilots go to various things. It can be finance inclined, where you're reporting to financial institutions, public and private, so that these facilities can earn more revenue or become more sustainable and profitable. Because as they become more profitable, then the ability to scale out facilities like them increases, of course. And then the metrics on what emissions are happening or being reduced in this case get reported into the national inventories or the mitigation outcomes for international trading. All of these go into the nationally determined contributions registry or a registry of nationally determined contributions to understand what these countries as a whole are actually starting to emit from these types of facilities. And as you scale this out in a national sense, you can get an understanding of emissions from every facility and what a country's contributions are to environmental impact and how they can implement new regulatory incentives to combat negative environmental impact. Next slide, please. The first one we did was a landfill facility. We did waste monitoring and we did a data capture on the waste monitoring and emissions capture side. This facility was in a smaller area, but it also produced enough energy to provide energy to 700 local homes, which is great. And it captured the methane from the production of that landfill. It was fully digitized, and that was our step one to get DigitalMRV integrated. But then we still came back to that problem of how do we understand the confidence in the data? Yes, it's secure, but how can we start to trust it? Next slide. That's when we came into VSPT and their biodigester facility. So VSPT is a very large international wine group based in South America, and they have a lot of really strong sustainable goals for how they manage their waste, how they manage the production of their wine and their grapes, and what they do with the byproduct of it. So they have some really strong undertones on how to incentivize and utilize these facilities, not just for management of waste, but also taking in organic fertilizers, whether it's liquid or physical, and reutilizing that in their growing process as well. And they have milestones to become completely carbon neutral by 2050. And the biodigester facility in Molina, which is our second pilot, was one of the steps in that direction. Next slide, please. So this is a baseline on the biodigester. It actually provides enough energy from just the harvest waste to cover 60% of the energy for all of the wine production facilities for VSPT, from our understanding. But there are significant carbon and methane emissions that come from that organic feedstock, and capturing those methane emissions can enable the utilization of methane as energy to offset what would naturally happen. Next slide. I'll pass it over.
All right, well, thanks, Matt, for that intro. As you've heard so far in the presentation, everything is about the data coming from, these applications. And the data is very important because that leads to the financial or economic gains from these companies who are capturing their carbon emissions, and they get, rewarded for doing that. And so in this project, the collaboration we had with the team, Matt and others, was to make sure that all of the verification of DigitalMRV means your application is secure, and you trust the application data. But when you're running on bare metal hardware, there are risks, if you will, of the bare metal exposure and that tampering of the application, or pretending to be an application that's not the real application. So the security goes all the way down to the bare metal in this project. And what happened was, Steve, I think you were the one that booted up the Dell server with an application, or the project called EVE, which is one of the LF Edge projects, and that secures the bare metal, and it has a remote over, a transport layer security remote link to a control plane. So we talked about the data plane and the data in it being secure, and then the control plane that that is running that application also is secure. And so the control plane over that box is secure. And none of us, unfortunately, had to travel to Chile. That would have been fun, but instead they just shipped the box, and we had a lot of networking fun of trying to figure out how the network was actually connected. But essentially you have EVE running on the bare metal on the Dell box. It was installed, shipped on site, and once we had an internet connection, then it booted up and ran the application. So go to the next slide. And so what the EVE architecture looks like is, if you look in the middle of the slide, there's the stack of running EVE. It's got a TPM, so you know the security, and you can check all of these parameters about trusted boot functions and the trusted programming module. So EVE runs there, and then it boots the applications either as a virtual machine or a container type of image. In this case, we ran a VM, so we could run a bunch of things in that VM. And the applications can be updated remotely, deployed remotely, everything. Essentially, EVE is that control plane function that allows you to update and manage your application without ever having to go on site. And we ran this project through the Zadida open source. The Zadida has a developer trial that we ran this through, and it continues to run through that. And so that was a free way for us to manage this whole application. And this could be used for any sort of industrial applications. Again, you have secure control over the box. I think it was it just yesterday, U.S. Marshals, or, you heard all these cybersecurity tales. And it's mostly due to the fact that these edge boxes are not in a secure physical environment. They're just in some remote plant in Molina, Chile. So the LF Edge project gives us both a secure control plane, and then the Project Alvarium is a secure application plane. So next slide, I think I'll hand it off to Steve at this point.
Thanks, Kathy, and thanks, Matt. So both Kathy and Matt have mentioned that one of the hardest problems to solve is, yes, you can store this climate data in a ledger, but how do you know that data is trustworthy? How do you know that someone didn't spoof that data, alter that data? And for that, we're using the LF Edge Project Alvarium. So this slide is really an attempt to describe what Project Alvarium is and what is data confidence at a high level. And then in subsequent slides, we'll talk about how we applied this to both climate and the project in Molina, Chile. So first of all, Dell created a piece of software known as a data confidence fabric that attempted for the first time to apply a data confidence score to a piece of edge data. So on the bottom, we have a variety of sensors. And as those sensors are generating data and it's moving across left to right, a gateway, an edge server, a cloud, up into an application, what Alvarium does is it really records or it annotates the type of trustworthy software and hardware handling that's occurring along the path. So for example, Kathy had mentioned that the Dell hardware we used in this project has a TPM chip, which allows for some level of trust. The EVE operating system secures that hardware, which allows for another level of trust. So what Alvarium is doing is, as data is flowing across an edge ecosystem, it is recording the fact that this trustworthy handling is in place. And so you can see, for example, device signatures are being validated. The gateway, for example, went through a secure boot. We can tell that on that gateway, authentication has been enabled. And this allows you to attach scores, in this case, a score of 1. Yes, these features are enabled. So by the time the data passes from left to right on the bottom of this diagram, you actually have a measurement of how trustworthy this data is, which is solving the problem that Matt mentioned earlier, right? This climate data is going into a ledger. Do we have any record at all or any scoring mechanism to keep track of how confident we are that that data is valid? So given this description of what data confidence is and what Project Alvarium is, Dell donated the code in October of 2021. And then in 2022, these companies that Matt mentioned, IOTA, Zadata, Dell, ClimateCHECK, came together to try and apply this generic technology to a climate use case. So let's go to the next slide. Let's take a look at how we set up Project Alvarium working with the ledger. Next slide, please. So as Matt mentioned, this was a fully digital biodigester system, but we also still had people running around with clipboards and hard hats and spreadsheets, right? Which introduces some risk for error in the data. So the goal here was, if you take a look at the green data on the left-hand side, sensor data flowing in that's related to methane emissions, versus the data below the line, such as how much feedstock is being put into the biodigester. How many miles did the truck drive that brought that feedstock to the biodigester? All this is manual data, and therefore we need to treat it with a lower confidence score. But this is the high level view of what we're trying to do, right? We're measuring the confidence coming from sensor data, but we're also measuring the confidence of user data or manual data that's flowing through the server, the Dell server running EVE, and those confidence scores are put into the IOTA ledger for display by the DigitalMRV application. So let's drill down one more level on the next slide and take a look at how this works in practice with Project Alvarium. So that green data, right, the data coming from sensors, you could see that as it flows into the Dell server running Project EVE, we can annotate the fact that a TPM is being used. We can annotate the fact that PKI was being used to check signatures. We can annotate the fact that TLS was being used to encrypt the data. So that automated data coming from the sensors is much more higher confidence versus the manually entered data, which we can only say, yes, that data arrived to a trustworthy Dell server running a TPM in the EVE operating system, but we can't do a lot of the verification of that data that we would do if it were coming from a sensor. So all of these Alvarium annotations and the data end up in the IOTA ledger, and that allows an application to not only analyze the data for emissions information, but it also allows the user interface to state what is the level of confidence in the data that we have. So let's take a look at that user interface, and Matt, I'll turn it back to you to take a look at this next slide.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so you can see in this slide, we have a few different sources. The spreadsheets that collect the manual data that Steve had highlighted are stored and processed locally on that Dell Edge device. And so then there's an API pool pulling the data from that Dell Edge device into the cloud level as well for remote processing. And then there's the sensors that are pulling autonomous data. And if you look on the right, you can see that there's a data confidence associated with each of those data producing elements. The top being a spreadsheet has a much lower confidence of 40% because it has a higher margin for human error, and it does annotate that it is manually entered data. The 4 sensors that follow are automatically entered data or autonomously entered data, and they have a much higher degree of confidence because there's less room for manipulation in that data supply chain, if you will. And then the bottom one being a spreadsheet is saying that there's no data, there's very low confidence in what we're pulling from this. We haven't gotten an update on this in some time. So that's also something that gets flagged, sent to the operator and sent to us from the DigitalMRV side so that we can figure out what's going on with that data and we can respond proactively and try to keep those data streams up and flowing as consistently as possible. Next slide, please. Next, that's it, sorry. Yeah, so this is another example of what that looks like. Once you go down into the individual sensors, you can see all of the manually collected data on the current flow, the average flow, and then on the right, because it's a sensor, it has very high data confidence. You can see that it has a high level of data confidence as well. And then in the diagram at the bottom of it, it shows any gaps in the data. So that red line in the middle is a gap in the data for that day that an auditor can then come back to and say, okay, we have some gaps in the data. We need to understand, or we have questions that happen when we see those kind of gaps in the data. And that gives an auditor that kind of prompt so that they can dig a little bit deeper and provide confidence in the reporting side as well. Next slide. So on top of this, this was our implementation of using that just for this biodigester facility. But as we scale up the use of Project Alvarium in the climate and environmental sector, we can start to understand what confidence looks like in a more standard measure across the sector and not just in an individual implementation. Next slide. So some examples of this are utilizing the quantification of that data confidence for carbon credits so that you can have a value associated with the credit, something that is highly digitized and much more trustworthy is much lower chance of greenwashing. So that means the carbon credits that come off of that project, because it has that level of transparency and security, should be worth more. And this is something that we have been seeing in active conversations, and we will see come out in pilots this year as well. On the smart city side, this could be something more so aligned with renewable energy certificates and how you prove renewable energy production and consumption. And you can say, hey, I want to charge my electric vehicle, or I want to charge my electric devices with renewable energy. How do I verify that the energy I'm charging with is renewable? Are there RECs associated with the project and where the energy is coming from? And then how can I manage that more effectively? And then that also applies, of course, to the transportation side. If you do have an electric vehicle, you're trying to offload energy, you want to offload sustainable energy because it's more difficult to store sustainable energy into some kind of battery system, and then understanding the sustainability of the different components that access the energy. Next slide. To scale this, as I was saying, this also helped us create the open collaboration on digitizing impact with Gold Standard. Gold Standard is one of the leading carbon market standards and manages the Gold Standard registry. And we got charitable contributions from Google's charitable arm to support that. So we're actively open sourcing and developing new digital standards with things like Alvarium and data confidence integrated into those standards as well, so that we can see the industry grow and the trust in the data across the industry and its interoperability grow as well. And then that will wrap it up to go into the next slide, where we have a summary of solution partners, and we are open for questions.
Great. So we got a really good question here in the chat window, asking about how well this data confidence fabric can be used to attack the trustworthy AI problem.
That's our goal. Is if you think about AI looking, using a massive amount of training data, for example, currently the same problem exists, right? What's the source of that data? What's the journey that data took? How trustworthy is that data? Now with trustworthy AI algorithms, you have this sidecar that has metadata in it describing how trustworthy that data is. And so if we can begin to train our models to not only look at the data, but take advantage of a standard like Alvarium, so that our algorithms can begin to consider confidence scores when they make decisions, they can make different decisions based on how trustworthy the data is. So that is, that's not climate related per se. It could be, but I think it applies across all different verticals. And that's a direction we'd like to head with Project Alvarium.
Yeah, and it also comes into the different types of AI, because if you're doing edge, like machine learning based processing on the site, that's something that we could enable in the edge servers. And that's an annotation that could come in to say this data was managed and manipulated at the edge by some sort of AI and integration or machine learning integration. So if there's various points across the data supply chain that AI does come into contact with the data and increases its efficiency or security or uses it for something, like in computer vision systems, for instance, that's something that would need to be annotated and factored into how these projects and standards start to scale out.
And lastly, the part, the aspect that you have secure remote control of updating those applications, because AI and even these IOTA applications are so fast moving in terms of being improved for various reasons. And no project is immune from having bugs, right? So that's the other aspect, is these applications at the edge in the most remote of locations can be securely updated, because we have the lock on the box at the bare metal with the Dell, with the TPM, and you can keep upgrading your AI with new models deployed to the field.
Great, thank you. We have another question coming from Silvio. He's interested in conducting a pilot. Wondering if there are funds available, how that works, if there's use cases for the demo.
Yeah, the Zadida side was a free trial, so the deployment of Edge, that part's free. I don't know, Steve, if you want to donate Dell boxes or.
I guess my question would be, if you're talking about a pilot, which is a digital MRV pilot, Matt, you might have the most information about how that works, right? How do you decide to launch new pilots in different parts of the world?
Yeah, so for us on the digital MRV side, and I was going to echo a similar direction to Steve, because understanding what kind of pilot it is it an Alvarium based pilot, which is something that we would all, of course, work on together, or is it a digital MRV based pilot, which we would also work on together, but it'd be focused on something different. So understanding the use case for Alvarium, if it is an Alvarium based pilot, and focus on like an AI integration or something of that nature. If it's a smart city or various use case pilot, we typically have to understand if there's a methodology in place for the emissions that you're trying to monitor and mitigate or adapt to. So once we understand that, we can move towards a base agreement and work together with Dell and Sedata to scale this out into whatever use case you have, preferably from the digital MRV side, of course, focused on sustainability data and impact verification.
Great, thank you. We have Alexander asking about where he can find the open source code.
If you skip to that useful links slide, the next slide, there's at least some links to, at least high level links to some of these projects that usually can take you to the GitHub repositories or other open source repositories.
Yeah, that's one thing. Is there's a number of different open source projects that came together for this. IOTA being an open source distributed ledger, Alvarium being an open source implementation, and then Sedata with their EVE capabilities also being open source. So we brought all those together under the Linux Foundation to see what this looks like as a combined initiative, and then we're scaling out with other open collaborations as well. So depending on what code you're looking for, you can find it in these various locations.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Silvio mentioned something about hackathons. Those are great for open source projects because, we'd be happy to sort of collaborate or mentor all of the EVE partners. If you go to this LF Edge Slack channel, you'll find both Alvarium and EVE and other projects, Open Horizon, a whole bunch of stuff. And then if you get the project leads on board, they could mentor the people doing the hackathon.
Yeah, and because these are under Linux, this is an open initiative, and like anybody can join LF Edge to come and collaborate with us on Project Alvarium as well. So if you have outside use cases that you want to bring into Project Alvarium outside of the digital MRV use case that we've been exploring, then that's another way to collaborate, is to join LF Edge, become a member of Project Alvarium, and help advance the state of data confidence with us together.
Great. I think that takes us to the end of the Q&A. We'll leave it open for another minute or two in case anyone has any additional questions.
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, Silvio, I see that you mentioned Earth Day in Miami as well. When would that be? Is that like do we have any information on that?
Isn't it usually sometime in April? Earth Day, April 22nd?
Earth Day's in April, yeah. Is Dell going to integrate these frameworks into their hardware?
April 22nd.
Yeah, that's our long-term goal, right? But when you think about why Dell could have kept this technology in-house, but that doesn't make any sense because you can see how many partners we need to bring together a full data confidence fabric. So our strategy with the donation has been, let's build up industry interest. Let's find partners at the hardware level, at the operating system level, at the ledger level. And once that, once that ecosystem starts to take shape, then there's more incentive for hardware companies like Dell, Intel, ARM to actually start embedding the Alvarium SDK in their products.
Yeah, I know we would love to see this as something you could just order the Dell Edge device yourself, and it already has the software integrated into it. You can see, LF Edge or EdgeX Foundry on the Dell website, and then you've got Alvarium integrations, and you select those as something that can come directly from the factory. I think that's where we would all like to get it to at some point. It's just a matter of continuing to progress the frameworks and capabilities.
So we did have another question about, I know, Kathy, you mentioned earlier in your update that you didn't get to go to Chile, that the box was mailed to you. Were any of the application developers from Alvarium or IOTA needed on site at all?
Nope.
Nope. Darn.
There was a 30-minute video call where we walked around the site with them and we looked over the implementation, but they were able to get everything plugged in and installed on site, and then left it up to us to take it from there.
Great. So I think that that concludes the Q&A. Just for anyone not following, we did have somebody ask about whether or not we have a publication with these results, and the answer is yes, we do. I put the link in the comment window, but if you go to lfedge.org, if you click on that, and you go to you go to resources and then case studies, you'll find it there along with a couple of others. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for participating. Thank you to our speakers for putting this together. And this will have a recording available on our YouTube channel shortly. So thank you everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.